The last 30 minutes, one more speaker, and his name is LeeJasper. LeeJasper is the former Deputy Mayor of London and founder of Blaksox. LeeJasper, over to you, sir.
I'm just making sure you can hear me very well.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great stuff. Well, look, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this international conference here today. And I know you've had a long day, so I shan't bore you with the elaborate and lengthy elaboration of a politician or a preacher. I shall keep it short and punchy to wake you up and send you off with some fire in your belly. My name is LeeJasper. I was born in the north of the country, in Manchester, in United Kingdom, England. My father's Jamaican, my mother is half Sierra Leone and half English. And growing up in the United Kingdom was a trial indeed for a person of colour. And invariably, in the early days, in the 60s and 70s here in the United Kingdom, it meant that you came into contact with the law, and I was no different from many young people in that situation. We had a law over in the United Kingdom called the SUS law, which was you could be arrested on suspicion of committing a crime to people or property unknown. The only evidence needed against you was the word of a police officer to say that you looked like you were about to commit a crime, and you were convicted and sent to prison. Well, that inevitably was a law which was vigorously contested by people of my age group in our youth, and having fought a number of racist police officers, ended up in prison as a consequence of defending our inalienable rights not to be criminalised by a racist criminal justice system. Came out of prison, read Malcolm X's autobiography, had a council with my part African, part Caribbean family. You know what that's like. You sit in the chair, you're surrounded by aunties and uncles. Everybody begins to regale you with why it is that what your name is Jasper and what that means and how you've let this family down in shame and so on and so forth. And having been suitably upbraided by my elders, I decided I'd take a degree. I took a degree and came to London. In London, you may have been aware quite recently of a new series of programs on TV by the international Hollywood producer, Steve McQueen, who produced the Small Axe series on BBC One. It's on iPlayer if you haven't seen it already. And one of those was the Mangrove 9. And that was an organisation in West London who fought the police to a standstill after the police tried to politically crush them as a black power organisation in the 70s. When I came to London after getting my degree, I went straight to work for the Mangrove. After being there for a number of times, I founded a number of national organisations, the National Black Caucus, which was the Black Lives Matter movement of its day, as well as the National Assembly Against Racism, the biggest national anti-racist movement in the United Kingdom, as well as Operation Black Voter Registration Drive that was inspired by Martin Luther King, knowing that if we didn't have economic power as well as political power, then we would always be at a disadvantage. After being elected as national spokesperson for many national black organisations, I was then selected to become the Deputy Mayor of London under the auspices of Ken Livingstone. And I became responsible as a policing director for London and responsible for equalities in London. Well, that was fairly strange for a young man that had sat on a prison bunk in strange ways. 30 years later, was interviewing the Metropolitan Police Commissioner for their jobs, everybody applying for a new vacancy that had occurred. And there was I doing the interviews, having previously 30 years been sat in a very disgusting prison bunk. I had great times at the Mayor's office. I was responsible for placing the statue of Mandela in Trafalgar Square, the only statue of a black politician in London that was placed in Trafalgar Square. I was responsible for putting in the procurement diversity in business, with black businesses accessing in contracts. I was the first chair of the Olympic London 2012 Olympic Diversity Committee, the first time in Olympics history that it ever had a diversity committee in Olympic Games. And managed to double the number of black and ethnic minority recruits in the Metropolitan Police Service, which was remarkable given the history of that organisation, and worked with many people, including Peter and others, on keeping London as an international world and global trade centre. I was there when the 7/7 bombings happened, so I was, as policing director, responsible for making sure that London responded and bounced back from the terrible tragedy of those terrorists' attack. But I'm here today to talk to you. It's a little bit about me. I'm here today to talk to you about Black Lives Matter, diversity and the economy. It's an economic conference after all. And so my focus is going to be on very much the strategic economic trends that we as the African and African diasporas can experience. And let's start with Black Lives Matter. The tragic death of those 8 minutes 9 seconds that we saw of the video of the murder of George Floyd resonated around the world. And as a consequence, we saw the largest rise of black mobilization in the African diaspora and even on the continent itself, and particularly in America, of African descendants who were fed up to the back teeth with the kind of institutionalized racism and criminal justice processes that saw our communities racially profiled and targeted by police services around the world. And as a consequence, the largest gathering of global anti-racist demonstrations ever seen in world history erupted in everywhere from Bangkok to Beijing to Barbados, all the way to South London, Brixton. Millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people marched around the world demanding that Black Lives Matter. And this is an important statement, because Black Lives Matter is not just an issue for those of us living in the diaspora who face the predations of institutional racism and white supremacy in the corridors of power. It is also a life and death matter for people on the continent, as the EndSARS movement has shown in Nigeria, with the brutal killing of over 102 people recently reported at the Lekki Tollgate massacre, and the almost, inhumane, cruel and brutal treatment by the Nigerian police service of its own citizens, which is to be condemned. But they're not alone. If you look to Jamaica, Jamaica's police is only second to that of SARS in its corruption and the level of violence that it inflicts on its own people. So whilst we may look to America and the United Kingdom and others for the issues of Black Lives Matter, I would suggest to you they're equally important, or probably more important, on the continent itself. But let me just give you a flavour of the international scope of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know that the biggest African diaspora outside of Nigeria, the biggest African diaspora in the world, is in Brazil, with Afro-Brazilians making up the largest diaspora on the planet outside of the African continent. And up there we saw just recently João Alberto Silveira Freitas, who was murdered in Porto Alegre, a black man who went into a shopping centre and was beaten to death by the security guards. You can see the tragic video. If you can stand the trauma that it inflicts upon you, it is there for you to see. And we can see with the Bolsonaro, who's a sort of baby Donald Trump in Brazil, an epitome of white supremacist racism, is crushing the African Brazilian community with a ruthlessness that we haven't seen for a long time. And in July, a young black man, this time 17, was caught stealing a chocolate bar from a local supermarket. He was stripped to his pants and he was bullwhipped by the 2 security guards. That again is on video, and you can see it for yourself as he excruciates, screams in deep pain as a consequence of their torture. He was bound, tied, gagged, his pants were pulled to his ankles, and then he was whipped. And they filmed themselves doing it. That's the arrogance and the evilness of these people that can afflict this on black people in Brazil. And then if you see João Pedro Matos Pinto, a 14-year-old black boy, beautiful black boy, you would have him as your son and son-in-law any day. He was shot in the back in his own house by security services. who were chasing another gang and shot through his window and ended up shooting him in the back, 14 years old, dead. If you look to France, you'll know the case of Adam Traoré, who was murdered in 2016, surrounded by the French gendarmes, that's what they call the French police, and he exclaims the words, "I can't breathe," as they're pinning him down and loses his life. And French, black people in France rose up and continue to rise up in the wake of George Floyd's murder, calling the name of Adam Traoré as their own George Floyd and death in custody. And I just want to bring your attention to one more case in France. It's a young man called Theo. Do you know he was raped by the gendarme who used a baton inserted in his anus and brutally raped that black boy in France? This is the level of evil and sadistic violence often inherited from colonial times on the African continent itself, and now finding its way into the streets of Europe and so on. And of course, you cannot help but go to our cousins in Australia, the Aboriginal community. 449 deaths of Aboriginals in Australian prisons. This is an apartheid level of injustice that our brothers and sisters are facing down there. And they're facing it in isolation because we don't extend the family of the African diaspora beyond its usual confines. And yet in Australia, we find the most horrific and brutal types of apartheid. Kamanji Walker, 19, shot dead last November. Tanya Day, 55, fatal injury after being arrested by the police. David Dungai, he was recorded saying, "I can't breathe," 24 times. This "I can't breathe" thematic that we hear from George Floyd is now become a metaphor, not just for those who are suffering the strangulation or beating from police officers, but it's also a broader metaphor for the lack of freedom that black people suffer all over the world. And in Australia again, Miss Do, 22, suffered as she was left battered and bleeding in a police cell. She didn't get the treatment she needed and died of septicemia. And there was one case in Australia where they left an Aboriginal black man in the back of a police van in 36-degree heat, and that gentleman literally died, having been burnt to death in the back of a police van. If you go to Australia and you look up these things, you will be shocked at the level of violence that you will see there. And of course, in America, you had the murder of Tamir Rice, 12 years old, Eric Garner, 26, Breonna Taylor, shot in her own home. George Floyd is a case that we all know about. And why I mention that is because it's very important that the Black Lives Matter movement begins to move internationally. We're working with the George Floyd family, facilitated by Judge Peter Herbert, to bring together an international platform around what we demand as ethical policing reform, not just here in the West, but on the African continent as well, where we want ethical policing. We want policing that treats people as human beings. We don't want corrupt policing. And we think it's time for an international African-led diaspora discussion, which we can put to the United Nations and the African Union, setting out our views on that. And just on that, because the international context of the Black Lives Matter movement is important in terms of the African Union, because a statement was put out on the 29th of May by the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Moussa Faki Mahamat, and issued a strong statement condemning the murder of George Floyd. And also the United Nations on June the 19th passed a resolution mandating the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, together with United Nations experts, to prepare a global report on systemic racism and excessive force used against people of African descent by law enforcement agencies across the world. What I'm saying, brothers and sisters, is that we need to be part of that discussion. We need to come together using the internet, a means of communication that allows us to have an international impact on these discussions, And we're certainly going to be working with the George Floyd family to hook up Brazil, Nigeria, Jamaica, Britain, France, even Spain. I haven't even had time to speak about Spain and southern Italy, where Africans are dying in the Mediterranean, being brutally exploited in slavery by the Libyan government in North Africa, and seeking their escape crossing the Mediterranean to southern Italy, and dying in their thousands, like a macabre recreation of the Middle Passage crossing of transatlantic slavery, where so many of our ancestors were thrown overboard when they were sick and ill as excess packages, damaged goods that captains threw overboard. So we can see that the African diaspora throughout the globe is in difficulty. Now let me move on to Britain, because Britain is where we're based. And let me tell you, this is only my view, and you may agree with it, you may not. I think the time for black people in Britain is over. I think that the 1,000 years of British dominance, of the sunset never setting on the British Empire, all of that colonial karma, the brutality, the slavery, the lack of acknowledgement, the refusal to recognize the African contribution to the making of modern Britain. It may surprise some of you, but the transatlantic slavery period was so successful, so profitable for Britain, that it actually cleared its national debt of the time. We've seen the Industrial Revolution here in the United Kingdom was actually funded by the profits made by transatlantic slavery and the trade of Africans. Such were the fabulous riches that you've heard the saying that the streets of London were paved with gold. Well, that saying comes from the transatlantic slave period. And we've seen this country develop with the blood, bone and cement and forced labor of our people over many, many, many generations, with no acknowledgement, with no recognition, and with no value. And now that Britain has decided to cut its own economic throat in an act of self-economic abuse by leaving the European Union, and that's largely fueled by its failure to recognize its historic past. And I'll explain why. Because in failing to recognize its historic racism in its past and come to terms with it, the poison of racism continues to exist. And that poison has resulted in the profound arrogance of British white people who believe in British exceptionalism, just like Trump believes in American exceptionalism, that they can reconquer the world, they can then run the Empire 2.0 again, that they can struggle this brave little island against the massed, markets of the world and succeed and stride the world again. This is the absolute abhorrent foolishness that now infects the British psyche, to the extent that they have taken a knife, cut their own economic throat, and left a European Union market with 750 million potential customers, so that they can seek to make their own way. This nation, such a small nation, and now facing economic crisis of a no-deal Brexit as we rattle towards the deadline of a European Union no deal, only 30 days to go. We have a COVID recession that has seen massive impacts. You know, the combined impacts of the economic recession of COVID and no deal is going to impact the economy, according to the Oxford University, of £21 billion. And you know what they say about all great empires, my friends, is that they all come to an end. Martin Luther King said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends inevitably towards justice. Every dog has his day, however long that may last. I say that the day of British ascendancy, economic and otherwise, is over, and that the colonial karma, the sins of their historical past, now come home to haunt them, like chickens coming home to roost, as Malcolm once said. So I don't believe there's a future in the United Kingdom. And let me say further, I don't believe there's a future in Europe. I don't know if you've read the famous French economist, Thomas Piketty. If you haven't, then I suggest you do. He wrote a tome, over 10,000 words, a book called Capital, Thomas Piketty, P-I-K-K-E-T-Y. Look him up. And he predicts and done an analysis of economic development in Europe. And what he demonstrates is that their annual growth of GDP has never really moved beyond 2 or 3% a year on average for that whole period, and is slowing down. Why? Because the markets of the people that they're selling to have become absolutely maximized. There's only so many washing machines you can sell and cars in Europe. What he predicts is that their GDP growth will stall at 2% will be the maximum that they can achieve. And he's proven to be remarkably right. That book was written 7 years ago, and those economic forecasts still pertain very true today. That's why you see the European Union in economic crisis. That's why you see Greece and Italy and Spain and others struggling and pulling down the European economies. And that will only get worse as time goes on. So what I would say is that like any great empires, these times of these great empires are over. And it behoves us now to look to Africa for our liberation. And let me tell you why. Because the African economic growth is such rates that Europe would die for those rates. 4% growth, 5% growth, 6% growth in very many areas. Africa is now performing. It is probably the last massive untapped market in terms of consumer marketing and commodification that remains in the world. And of course, Britain is going to have to renegotiate its trade agreement with all those African countries. And again, I think this is where the African diaspora comes in here in the United Kingdom and the US. But we need to be speaking to each other to make sure that those trade agreements with Biden and those trade agreements with Brexit Britain are advantageous and not exploitative to the African development needs. And of course, the African Union, 6th region of the diaspora for the African Union, a college that now recognizes that us in the diaspora form a part of the formerly part of the African Union, recognized constitutionally, is about to establish its headquarters in a compound, Jamaica. And if you don't know what a compound is, that's the last bastion of slaves, enslaved Africans who held out against slavery in Jamaica, created a village called a compound in the hills. And British had to sign a peace agreement with them. And it's in that historic site that the African Union 6th region diaspora headquarters will be established. And of course, on the African continent, we've got to think about land rights and trade. The legacies of colonialism. Came back from Kenya recently and met people who were serving 6 years for stealing a plantation from the Del Monte pineapple plantation in Kenya. I've seen African Kenyan tea farmers who have been brutally exploited in large plantations that were ceded from the British Empire to British multinational companies, paying a pittance for African produce that is selling for huge amounts of money in Europe. And of course, as an African diaspora, we pay billions into the African economy through remittances. The United Nations estimated there was 88.6 billion. That's equivalent to 3.7 of Africa's total GDP that was flowing into the continent in last year, 2019. But of course, we also know that we've got massive outflows of illicit capital because of the lack of ethical governance on the continent. And we have to stem that. Corrupt leaders are entering into corrupt relations with businesses who are filling up their Swiss bank accounts with the hard-earned cash meant for our African brothers and sisters. That has to stop. We have to stem that illicit and unethical corruption that leads to so much. Well, look, I've spoken for far too long already after what's been a long day. I think the summation of my hypothesis is the time of black people in Europe is over, that you should gather your capital, that you should invest in emerging economies on the African continent, that you should work through the internet and the digital diasporas in order to link up on civil, ethical governance issues so that we can create an African continent using the pressure from the wider African diaspora in partnership with people in the continent who are being shot and murdered as a consequence of trying to fight corruption or tackle police brutality so that we can create a future for all our children. You've got to remember, Africa has the biggest, in 1990, New York had more mobile phones than the whole African continent. Today, the African continent is the biggest mobile money market in the world. I can sell reconditioned fridges to a trader in Kinshasa from here in the United Kingdom just using eBay and the internet. So the opportunities for us, even though the economic decline in Europe is going to be profound as those colonial chickens come home to roost, should not be underestimated. And we can locate businesses here whilst living in Africa, and the international trading economy gives us that glorious opportunity. The future is ours. The continent has the youngest population of any ethnic group on the planet as they continue to grow beyond 1 billion over the next few years. So the economy is bright. The future, though challenging, can be, if we work together, absolutely fantastic. And I hope that this last 2 days has given you some insight and opportunity to consider what the possibilities of this bright future may hold for you.
Wow, thank you so much, LeeJasper. Thank you so much for what you had to say there.
This work is by Kevin Tomlin, who is a music historian, artist and art teacher.